All right, let's talk about parking. Specifically, let's talk about how I park, because I think I do it a bit differently than most people do, and it's kind of a method that I came up with just through some trial and error and what makes sense to me. So, first of all, what is parking? Well, parking is a method of kind of thread management when you're cross-stitching. Kind of the traditional cross-stitching method, I think, is cross-country stitching, so where you take a thread and you kind of follow where that thread is stitched all around the pattern until you run out of the thread. In parking, you take a thread and then you do all of the stitches that is in that color in a small area, and then when you're done with that color in that area, you park your thread, in other words, leave it in the position where it's going to be used next, and then go back and do a different color in that small area, and you continue until the small area is completed. So cross-country tends to be more by thread or by color, whereas parking is more by small area. So, I said I park differently than a lot of people do. There's two big differences that I've seen. One is that I think most people tend to park in a 10 by 10 grid as their small area. For me, I like to do a 20-stitch row. The other big difference is that most of the people that I see talking about parking will work with a thread in that area, then park it, take their needle off it, put their needle on the next thread, and then work with that thread in whatever area they're working in. I keep all of my threads on the needles at all times, and it doesn't make as big of a mess as I initially thought that it would. It works out fine. So that's what kind of parking is, very briefly. I will definitely link at least one video that I can think of to kind of what I'm considering the more typical parking down in the description below in case you want to check that out. This is kind of what makes intuitive sense to me. However, thinking about it, I can see how it would not make sense to a lot of people. So, you know, if it doesn't make sense to you, then obviously it's not for you, but I wanted to put it out here in case you see it and you're like, ah, that's perfect. Let's see, there was one other thing I was going to say. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is just kind of as a heads up, parking does not make your back super neat. Parking does not, at least the way I do parking, is not terribly thread saving. It's not horribly thread intensive, but it's not the most efficient method in the world either. So just kind of as a heads up, those are a couple things to consider. I'm going to show you on my 4 Heavenly Beasts project from Heaven and Earth Designs. I've just finished page 1 of the large chart format, and I'm about to start page 2. So a couple of things to note here. You can see I stagger all of my rows where the rows end, so that way I don't get any column lines. And I'm going to show you how I do that. I do have my fabric gridded. Quite frankly, I am never going to stitch without gridding again because it solves so many counting problems for me. I will link a video on the gridding method. It's exactly what I use below. I also have waist threads here, how I end my threads. I'm doing this 2/1 on 18 count, so I start them with the loop method, but I end them with these waist threads. It's not a critical feature of parking, but it definitely works really well with parking. And I will link a video down below of someone explaining how this works in case you're interested. The only difference between what I do and what she does in that video is because I work in a 20-stitch row and she works in a 10-stitch block. She puts her waist threads 10 stitches away from her work, whereas I put them 20 stitches away. So there's that. And these threads are all parked, which means that when I go to the page below, every single one of these threads is exactly in the position it needs to be to start working. So when I come to these, I don't have to look at the color, I don't have to worry about anything, I know exactly where they work. So, I'm going to be doing some experimental camera angles, not angers, so that you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to pause the video here. Alright, as long as I don't bump anything, we should be okay. I'm going to show you a tiny fraction of the actual chart. This is about 200 stitches at the very beginning of page 2. And I want to show you this so I can show you A, how I prepare the chart, and B, when I'm actually stitching what's going on. So, the first thing with parking is you have to be consistent about how you make your stitches. You absolutely must make your stitches the same way every time, so that way you can know when you come to a parked thread what stitch it belongs to. So I always make my stitches from the bottom left to the top right, then I come down, and I go from the bottom right to the top left. So this is always the beginning of where I park something, which means if I am looking at my chart and I go, okay, I need to park something in this space. For this is going to be the next spot that I use a thread. Now, the box is the stitch. Each of these little, points would be one of the 4 holes around the stitch. Which stitch do you park it in? Well, you park it where you're going to start your stitch, so it will be here. Always. There's no question as to what, I hope you can see that color. There's no question as to where that goes. Similarly, if I'm stitching merrily along and I come to a thread that's parked right here, I might be inclined to go, oh no, which stitch does this belong to? Because it could belong to this stitch, or this stitch, or this stitch, or this stitch. Except, I always start my stitches with my thread at the bottom left, so it must go to this stitch, where I would go up and then down. So, that's the first thing. Do your stitches consistently. Bear in mind that when I'm showing you this, I'm always going to be parking in the bottom left corner of a given stitch, but you can park wherever depending on how you stitch. Now, in terms of preparing the chart, I like to stagger my edges, so I draw in lines on the chart showing where my edges are, so just so that I can be consistent with it. Now this is page 2, so I'm going to look at my page 1, which you can see I've highlighted up, and I'm going to keep off screen because I don't want to show you more than this tiny fraction of the chart. Whoa, bumping the camera. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go, my staggering is across these 3 squares because I wanted to be sure that, I wanted to be sure that I could still see it on both pages equally. So let me just double check. Okay, so I have stitched along here. I'm just going to draw it in. And so the way that I do this is, and this is just, I'm just drawing it up and down because I know how the pattern goes. But basically I pick whatever my main edge is going to be. So it's going to be right here, it's going to be my main edge. And then I will mark every other stitch along this main edge. And then I'll do 1 stitch out, 1 stitch in, 1 stitch out, and so forth. So this is all stitching that's already done on my piece. Okay. Now, I like to park in a 20 stitch row, so I'm going to count 20 stitches over from this line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 20. And so this is going to be my other main line for my column of 20 stitch rows. Because of the way the first page was shaped, you'll notice that instead of being a 20 stitch row that's like 2 blocks, it's kind of a half a block and a block and a half a block. That's no big deal because these grid lines correspond to my gridding lines on my fabric, so I can just see exactly where I am. So again, I'm going to go, okay, every other one along this main line is going to be an end of my stitching. And then this one poked out. So this is going to poke out. That one went, well, that one goes in because that went out, out, in, out. And so this way I've got a staggered 20 stitch rows, and I can just stitch from here until I hit that red mark and be done, go back, and so forth. It just helps keep me on track. So that is how I prepare my pattern for stitching, and I'll just do all of these columns all the way down the page. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and stitch the first row or 2 of this, so that way you don't have to watch me adding every single thread. And then once I've got a row or 2 established, I will come back and show you how I stitch those rows. Okay, there is some serious jury rigging going on here, so we're going to hope my camera does not take a nosedive onto my stitching. So, to begin, I am stitching right here. I've done the first 2 rows off of this chart, and normally when I stitch, I do the entire row and then I highlight it on the chart. However, I think for this first row that I stitch, I'm going to highlight each color as I go so you can kind of see what I'm doing. So, to begin, I see that in the first hole that I have where I need to make a stitch, I have a thread parked. Oh, and let's see if I can move this so you can see. down here, I have my needles. Hello, where are we? Needles. So for example, here's one of my needles. What I do with them when I get done with the stitching is I just kind of like gently poke them just far enough in that they stand upright. And I kind of try to, if this next stitch is over on this side, I put them over here. If the next stitch is over on that side, I put them over there to kind of keep it in less tangled. So I can see that in this first stitch that I need to make, I have a thread parked, so this must be the thread that corresponds to this little square. I kind of lift it up, and I find that if I just kind of very gently lift the thread up and kind of give it a little pop, then the needle pops right out and it doesn't get tangled. I'm going to make, I can see that I need to do 4 of these, so I'm going to just do 4 of these. And I go across. Okay, so I got 4 of those, which corresponds to these 4, and looking across that row, that symbol doesn't appear anywhere else, so I'm just going to go back along them. What's up, Lily? Apparently nothing is up. Can't get that into the hole. Okay, now I need to park this thread. So I'm going to look for the next spot I keep doing that. I'm going to look for the next spot that symbol appears. So I've done, see, this is what I normally would not bother to do until I was done with the whole row. I've done those 4, and the next spot that is going to appear is not that one, that is a different square. Okay, so the next spot is going to appear is right here, and then I'm going to park it as always, where I'm going to start it, so down in this corner, the lower left corner. So I can look and see that's going to be 3 in, and if I go 2 down from where my current stitching is, that will alright, that'll be the spot. And then I'm just going to take this needle, and normally I would do it a lot lower so that my thread is kind of stretched, but for right now, I'm just going to put it where you can see it. I'm just going to take that needle and barely poke it into my fabric. All right, so next is this symbol A. As it turns out, I happen to have a thread parked here, so I know that that thread must correspond to A. And so it looks like I have 2 A's in a row here, and then no more A's in this row. So I'm going to stitch those. Okay, so I did the A's. Mark that off. Now the next spot that A appears is A in a couple spots here, but I'm going to come to it first right there, which is the next row. 1, 2, 3 stitches in. Something looks a little off because I can see that I should have 2 right-facing arrows in a row here. And I know that I parked this A in the right spot because it should be this like dotted square and then 2 right-facing arrows and then the A. But I have a thread that's parked in the spot of the second right-facing arrow, which should not be the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go look up what the right-facing arrow corresponds to. Okay, then I'm going to pull out my skein of that thread. And I'm just going to double check that what I have parked there is indeed this color. Yep, that matches. So what that tells me is that I must have just parked it in the wrong spot. It's very rare for that to happen, but on occasion it does, and so that's how I just double check what that is. And if it had not matched, what I would have done is looked around for what other symbol it might have been and found out what it was. So I'm just going to move that back to where it's parked in the correct spot. All right, so a little problem solving. Okay, so now the next thread that comes up is a 6, and I apparently do not have a needle on this 6. Oh, there it is. All right, so this is 6. I can see, but as well as the fact that it's right after the A that I just finished, I can also see that it's at the beginning of this square and it's at the beginning of this square. So we're good. And then I'm going to go out until looks like 2 before the end of this square. The last 2 in this grid are actually E's. For Emily. Not really. So I just do half stitches along and then I come back and fill them in. One of the things that I really like about this method of parking is that it basically guarantees that I'm always going to be bringing my needle up in a empty or a square with a hole with a couple of empty squares underneath it. So the only time I'm going to bring my needle down, or the only time, okay. You know how bringing your needle up in a square where or in a hole where all the surrounding squares are full is a pain in the butt? You don't have to do that. You're always going to have some empty squares beneath it, and going down into a space that's fully surrounded is a lot easier. Okay, so I'm 2 back from that line, which means that I'm done with this. So time to go back. Now right now, because it's the very beginning of the page, it's actually fairly long stretches of a single color. Another nice thing about this method of stitching is that I really don't feel that the confetti, where there's like one stitch that's solitary all by itself of a single color, affects me that much. And I think that's because I'm not taking, oh my goodness, I split threads. This really is the weirdest. I'm gonna snip off the end of that thread, rethread it on the needle, and keep going. Anyway, Murphy's Law, everything that could go wrong will go wrong when you're filming. What I was saying was, because I don't unthread my needles, if there's just one square on a line that I need to stitch, that's fine. There's just one square on a line I need to stitch, no big. Which is nice because I like these patterns with detailing that often involves confetti. Okay, row of 6s is finished. The next spot that it's going to appear is going to be directly underneath where that first 6 was. So I'm going to put my thread in the lower left-hand hole of that square, and then park that sucker right here. So those 6s are done. Now the next thing is an E, and I don't have any threads parked there, so that tells me that I must need to start a new thread of E. So let me go figure out what E is. All right, here's E. Now when I'm parking, I have a needle minder full of needles. Now by the time I get down to the end of the page, most of those needles will be attached to threads and they will be sitting below my stitching. But for right now, at the beginning of the page, I have quite a few needles waiting for me to use them. I prefer size 28 needles. I think I'm currently using mostly the John James Petites with a few of just the regular DMC ones thrown in. They're slightly more prone to breaking because they are very slim and small, but I find that they're just awesome to stitch with, so that's what I do. Okay. And when I bought the, I think it's John James is the brand. When I bought them, I bought just a pack of like 50 off of eBay for, I don't remember how much, but it was quite reasonable. Okay, get through the hole, the correct hole. Okay. So I've done those 2 E's. Now to look for the next spot that E appears. Looks like it's going to be right here, which I can kind of see is diagonally back from that one I just stitched. And I know I just stitched those 2, so I can just very quickly be like lower left hole, diagonally back from that. That's something that with practice you get to be able to see that and do it pretty easily. At first I definitely had to count that kind of thing out. Okay, so I did my E's. And then there's these downward triangles, which again, I don't have anything parked right here, so that must mean that I need to start a new thread. Get another needle, all threaded up with a little loop on the end, so I can start using the loop method. I do the loop method from the front. Pretty sure that there was a video that I learned this from that I can link below, but it's pretty straightforward. Okay, now I can see that there's nothing but these downward triangles for the rest of the row, and that this is going to be one in from that last one. So I don't even need to count at this point, which is another thing I like about this. It really cuts down on how much counting I need to do when I can reference, like, just stop one short of the last row. I apologize if there's wiggle. I have my frame on a stand and it just naturally moves a little bit when I stitch with it. It's not a problem for stitching, but I'm realizing it may be a little bit nausea-inducing for video. So back we go. And then we are done. So I can see that the first spot that downward facing arrow is going to be 2 in from this grid line. Here's that grid line on my fabric. I'm going to go 2 back, so I'm in the lower left hole for that. And then I'm going to stick my little needle in here so that he'll stay put. Unfortunately, I can't, because I'm zoomed in so you can see my stitches. It's really hard for me to park where you can see that. And it looks like it's starting to get dark despite my best efforts, so I'm going to see if turning that light on helps a bit. Okay, now we're done with this. Okay, so that is how I work across a row. But I don't normally stop and do the filling in of colors each one. I find that I can remember what I've done well enough to do a whole row, because I don't usually get interrupted in the middle of a row, usually just because it's just a row of 20. Like, I can usually get that done, or if I get interrupted, I usually have time to finish it and then get up. So usually I'll just do this whole row and then color it in later. So let's do that. So I can see that this first one is a little dotted square, which I happen to know that I've not done, and if I didn't know that, I could just see that I didn't have anything parked there. So that tells me it's time to grab my list of colors. There it is. This is reddish brown, kind of coppery. Maybe a little dark to be coppery, but still, it's pretty. So I'm going to thread that needle. Alright, so I put that stitch in. I'm going to look for the next spot that appears. It's actually, there's one right below it, but that is on the stitching that I've already done. So the next spot that is going to appear is going to be here. And in this case, it's right after the next bump out. So I can just look for where that stitch is bumping out and do that. That probably didn't make much sense, but you know, what can I do? Okay, so here I have something parked. Must be that backwards arrow here. So, like I said, I'm not going to bother marking this off. I'm going to mark this off after I get done with the whole row. So, there we go. It would help if it would focus. Okay, so I've got 2 of these backward facing arrows in a row. And then I see that I skip one because there's that A. So I'm going to skip this stitch. And then there's 2 more of the backwards arrows. And then there's another backwards arrow, and I can see that it's 2 into the next block. So I'm just going to look for 2 into the next block based on my grid lines. And then there's no more backwards facing arrows, so it's time for me to go back and do the final leg on all of these crosses. And this is where it can get a little bit thread wasteful if, for example, you've got like 1 or 2 here and then 1 or 2 over here. I just do it anyway though, because I find that this is really, for me, a lot more fun of a method to use. Okay, so there's the rest of those backwards facing arrows. Now I'm going to look for the next spot it's going to appear. That's going to be down here. And here's a spot where it gets tricky that took me a little bit to get used to seeing. So this looks like it's 2 below the stitching because I can see that the stitching is highlighted here. But I know it's not because I know I've already done this row. So it's really 1 below this row. If I needed to park way over here, it would actually be 2 rows below the stitching because I haven't done the stitching over here for the row that I'm currently working on. So that's where the, so again, I'm just going to stick that sucker right in there. That's where the not highlighting as you go can get a little bit mind-bending. But my experience is you just kind of get used to it. So then I have a thread parked in this little gap. That little gap is an A, so I know that this thread is an A. And you can kind of not see it all. I'm starting to get a little bit of a tangly mess down here. And that's okay. I find that as long as I don't pull anything tight, I can just very gently lift my thread and my needle out of there. And now I have my needle and thread, and there's no knots. Okay, I swear everything that could give me grief today is giving me grief today. Anyway, we were right in the middle of doing this little A right here. So we're going to do that A. And then we're going to go over here and do this A. And then that's the last spot that A appears in this row. So we're going to go back. Or we're going to go back if I can find the hole with my needle. Again, if it can go wrong, it will, apparently. Okay. So it doesn't look like there's any A in the next row. In the row after that, there's an A right here. So let me count over to the lower left corner of that A. I know it's going to be 3 stitches in. I believe it is going to be 3 down from my current stitching or 2 down from that row that I'm currently working on. So, right there. And then I'm going to stick this little needle right in my fabric very lightly. All right, so then I just go to the next spot, the first empty spot, which is going to be here. And the first empty spot over here, because I know I did that A last, well, that means that that must be the 6. Oh, no! I pulled the needle off the thread under the fabric. I'm going to thread it on under the fabric. I go to great lengths not to turn my stitching over. I just do not like that. Okay. Got it. Thank you, needle threader. Okay, so I know there's 2 6s in a row. Then, of course, I put way too much in. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to do the beginning of 2 6s. Then I see that I'm going to skip over here. I happen to remember that I already did that backwards facing arrow, and I know that I did because it appears before the 6 in that row before. So that must be the backwards facing arrow. And then there's one after it, and then the 6s begin again. And that may not make sense to anyone but me, but it makes complete sense to me, which is why this is very easy for me. So I'm mostly trying to talk out loud how I do this. Okay, so that's for the last 6 of the spot, those 3. So I'm going to go back. And when I go back, I never have to count. I just have to look for the little half stitches and cross them. Which is another bonus to this parking, is it drastically cuts down on my counting time. And then there's 2 right here. And I have to cross them. And then, where does 6 appear next? Well, we did this row. So 6 appears over here. Now, in this case, I happen to remember that I just did those 3 and those 3 are 6s. And this 6 is like, this next spot where the 6s appear is like the last 2 of that. So I can just line my needle up with the last 2 of that. Know it's in the right spot in the lower left-hand corner of that stitch, and then park it. Now, let's see, the next empty spot is here. I did the 6s, I did the backwards arrow, so this must be this square. So I'm going to get my hands on that thread, and like I said, this one's going to go down kind of into where the mess is. So I'm just going to kind of like hook a finger under it, lift it up, pull it gently, and oh look, there's my needle and no tangles. Or no tight tangles, because I don't pull anything tight. Any tangles that might occur never tighten into knots. Okay. Yep, there's only one of these, so we'll just do this little guy and cross him right away. And then in the next spot, he's going to be down here, which is right next to this grid line in the next row, so, and then park him. So then the next empty spot is going to be, let's see, we did the 6s, so it must be this E. Or I could look at it and go, oh, this is 3 back from that grid line that I have here. I'm wondering if you can see my thread grid lines now. 3 back from the grid line, 3 back from the grid line would be the lower left corner of this E, so it must be the E. Just a couple different ways of figuring out exactly which stitch you're working with. So again, we do that little guy, there's no more in the row. The next one to appear is directly below that E, which makes parking it really easy because you just go down at the lower left corner of the hole, or the lower left hole of the stitch below what you just did. And then the rest that I have is these downward facing triangles. Must be this color because that's what's parked there. And as I work on this, I'll start to kind of recognize the colors too. And if I had like a bright copper parked there and I know that this downward facing triangle is a dark brown, that would tell me that there's something wrong. But again, that really rarely happens. And so again, I don't really have to count this because I know that this goes out until 1 stitch less than the row before. Then I personally like to keep my grid lines on top of my fabric, and this one doesn't want to be, so I'm just going to like run my needle under the grid line so that way, well, I should say I like to keep my grid lines on top of my stitching. I like to stitch just kind of underneath them. I find it just makes it easier for me to keep track of what is where. Plus it makes it way easier to pull them out. Okay, so this is 1 short of that previous row. So you can see where I'm starting to get that staggered edge too. Going back and crossing all of these. Whoa. Oh my goodness, I actually broke that gridding thread. That never happens either. Jeez. Okay, so downward facing arrows, we've done them all. The next one is directly below where that last one was. Well, I happen to remember where I ended that. So I'm just going to go down to directly below. Another way I can think about that is I happen to know that's that E that I parked, and it's directly to the side of it in the lower left corner. And then I just gently put my needle in. Now again, usually I would have my threads, I would put my needle in so low that my thread just goes straight down the page instead of kind of going down and looping up, because that again cuts down on tangles. But so you can see that I have needles parked, that's what I'm doing. And then I'm done with this whole row. And I just mark it off in one fell swoop. So that's usually how I work. And then it's just more of the same. You keep going. I'm going to need to leave my apartment really soon, so I think I'm going to stop there rather than demonstrating another row. I hope that that was helpful, and that it kind of gave you some ideas of how you might be interested in parking, or you might not be interested in parking that way. That's fine too. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you want me to film some more of me doing this later. If you need more clarification on something, I'm happy to do that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.